In this video, we're going to put together a very simple React application and consume the GraphQL endpoints that we created in the earlier section of this course. So what I'm going to do first of all is create a new React app using the create React app npm package, and I'm going to call that Fleet app. The installation is going to take a while, so you can actually go and grab a tea or a coffee and then come back to your machine once the installation has completed. So the installation has completed and we have now this Fleet app here. And what I will do, I'll just remove some unnecessary things from here like app.css. I'm going to empty that. I don't want this logo, and I'm going to return nothing for now. So just return null. Oops. So render return null. Okay, we're going to build up this component and some other components as well. And let's also cd into Fleet app because we need to install three more things. We need to install the React Apollo package. We will also need to install the Apollo Boost package, and last but not least, React Apollo and GraphQL as well. So these will be the dependencies for our project, so please install these as well. And then we're going to come back and continue with putting together the actual app. So we have these dependencies installed, and what I'm going to do is import two things in app.js. I'm going to import Apollo client from Apollo Boost, and I will also import the Apollo provider from React Apollo. Now, I want to add that even though we're using Apollo in React, you can also use Apollo and GraphQL in any other front-end framework, so in Angular, in Vue.js, and there are some other examples as well, but we're just using it for React. So once we have this set up, we can actually create a client, which is going to be an instance of the new Apollo client here. So we instantiate a new Apollo client, and we pass in one option for now, which is going to be the actual URI of the GraphQL endpoint that we have created. And for render, we're going to render a div, and then in there we get the Apollo provider as a component that allows us to pass in a client. And that's all what we need to do, because the next step is going to be to build up an actual user component here. So we're going to build this user component that will list the actual users with their cars in our system. So how can we do that? Well, under the source folder, let's create a new file called user.js, and we need to import React and then component from React. Then we also need to import query from React Apollo, which will allow us to write an actual query for querying GraphQL. And then I'm also going to do export default class user extends component. Okay, so that's how you would create a component in React, and this will again for now return null, so we're not going to return anything. So what do we want to do here in this user component? So we pass that user component as a child to Apollo provider, which means that we will have access to the GraphQL stuff because that propagates down here. So we save app.js, and now in user.js we actually want to make a query. Now the best way to do this would be to create a new variable called query.js, and in query.js I'm going to specify my GraphQL query. And in order to do that, I'm going to import something that you already are familiar with, which is this GQL from GraphQL tag. So this will allow me to create a query using the template literal syntax. So exactly in the same way that you saw me using this in the earlier section of this course. So I want to query for all the users, and I want to get their ID, their name, the cars that they own with the ID, the make, the model, and the color of those cars. And I will also do an export default query so that we can actually get this query in other parts of our code. So where do we want to get the query? We want to get it in users.js, or I'm sorry, this is user.js. So what I will do is in the render function, I'm going to say return, and then what are we going to return? Well, we're going to return a div, and in that div I'm going to use the query component here, which allows us to specify a GraphQL query. Now this also accepts an attribute, which is the query, and now we would have to specify the query in here, but remember, we were clever and we created a separate file for our query, so we can just import that and say that the query that we pass in to the query component that's part of React Apollo is that query that we've written in that other file. Now, very simply, this query returns us, and we can use the new syntax in JavaScript to extract the data and just do something like return null for now and do console.log data. So let's just log the data and see if we actually get that. And of course, in order to use this user component, we'll need to import it here. So I'm going to import user from user, and I'm going to add that. Oh, I already added it, so it's right here. Okay, so let's save this and start up our application, but we also need to start the GraphQL endpoint. So I have the GraphQL endpoint, 2 folders above here, so you need to also make sure that you have this running. I'm going to use nodemon app.js to start up this GraphQL instance, and if you remember, this is using port 3000. Now the problem is that when we start up the React test web server with npm start, that will also use port 3000. So I'm going to pass in something here called port, an environment variable to be 8080, and then I'm going to type in npm start after that. So this is now going to make sure that the test HTTP application server for React is running on port 8080 as opposed to port 3000. And once the npm start command finishes to run, a browser window opens that opens localhost 8080, and we see an error here, which is in fact correct because every React component must have a render method that returns something, and I forgot to add a return statement in here. So let's fix this. And the good thing about this development server with React is that it has hot reloading. So if we hit save to save the file, then we get an actual refresh of the browser window as well. Okay, so it seems that we have one more error here. So let's see. And the new error that we get is because of a typo, but at least you get some debugging experience as well here. So it's Apollo provider that we need from React Apollo. So that means that we need to update this here as well to say Apollo provider and provider. And now let's save. And now what we get after the browser refreshed is of course our users. And let's see here. So we have the list of users. If we expand one, then we get the car as well, and then we get the details of the car. Perfect. So we have achieved that in user.js, we use the query component from React Apollo to query for the data based on a query that we have extracted to a separate file, and that returns us some data to the console. So far so good, and we're going to continue by displaying this data in the actual browser as opposed to the console in the next video.